The winter wind cut through the small frontier town like a knife, carrying with it flurries of snow that danced across the wooden boardwalks and settled on the shoulders of the crowd gathered in the town square. It was auction day, a monthly occurrence that brought ranchers, merchants, and curious onlookers from miles around to bid on everything from cattle and horses to farm equipment and household goods. But today's auction had drawn an unusually large and somber crowd, for among the items to be sold were two young women whose fates hung in the balance. Sarah stood on the auction block, her light blue dress doing little to protect her from the biting cold. Her blonde hair was woven into two long braids that fell over her shoulders, and her hands trembled, though whether from cold or fear, she couldn't say. Beside her stood Mei Lin, whose dark blue dress seemed to absorb what little warmth the winter sun provided. Her black hair was similarly braided, and her face remained stoic despite the tears that threatened to spill from her dark eyes. Both women had been brought to this moment by circumstances beyond their control, their lives reduced to a transaction in a town that cared little for their stories. The auctioneer, a portly man with a thick mustache and a voice that carried across the square, began his pitch with practiced enthusiasm. He spoke of the women as if they were livestock, listing their supposed qualities and abilities with a detachment that made Sarah's stomach turn. The crowd murmured and shifted, some men stepping forward with interest in their eyes, others hanging back with expressions that ranged from pity to disgust at the entire proceeding. Sarah had ended up here after her father's debts had consumed everything their family owned. When he died suddenly, leaving behind a mountain of IOUs and unpaid loans, the bank had seized their small farm. With no family to turn to and no means of support, Sarah had been classified as a ward of the county, her future to be decided by whoever could pay the fee the county demanded for her care. It was a thinly veiled form of indentured servitude, legal in this remote territory where the law was whatever those with power decided it to be. Mei Lin's story was different but equally tragic. She had come to America with her family, full of hope for a better life than the one they'd left behind in China. But her father had been killed in a mining accident, and her mother had succumbed to illness shortly after. With no other relatives and no money, Mei Lin had found herself at the mercy of the territorial authorities, who saw her as just another problem to be solved through the auction block. The bidding started slowly. A few ranchers called out modest amounts, their voices competing with the wind and the stamping of horses tied nearby. Sarah watched their faces, trying to discern which of these hard men might offer the least terrible future. Some she recognized as decent folks who might treat her fairly in exchange for honest work. Others had reputations that made her blood run cold. Then she saw him. A tall man in a brown vest and gray shirt, a black cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes, standing at the edge of the crowd. He hadn't spoken, hadn't bid, hadn't even seemed particularly interested in the proceedings. His weathered face was difficult to read, and something about his stillness drew Sarah's attention. He looked different from the others, though she couldn't quite say how. The bidding had reached $5 when one of the more prosperous ranchers, a man named Callahan, stepped forward. Sarah knew his reputation. He went through hired hands like water, worked them until they broke, and had a particular cruelty when it came to women. The crowd seemed to sense that Callahan's bid of $10 would likely be the final one. No one else seemed willing or able to match it. The auctioneer raised his gavel, calling once, twice, and just as he was about to bring it down, the quiet man in the brown vest raised his hand. $1, he said, his voice calm and clear despite the absurdity of the bid. The crowd erupted in laughter. The auctioneer sputtered, unsure whether the man was mocking the proceedings or simply addled. Callahan turned, his face darkening with anger at the interruption. But the man in the brown vest didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a single dollar bill, and held it up for all to see. "The bid is $10, the auctioneer said, trying to regain control. "You can't bid $1 when the current bid is 10. "I'm not bidding on the auction," the rancher said, his voice steady. "I'm buying out their debt directly. Both of them. $1 total. That's the actual amount the counties owed for their care up to this point. The rest of this is just you vultures trying to profit off misery." A murmur ran through the crowd. The man was right, technically. The county's actual expense for housing the two women had been minimal, just a few weeks of basic provisions. The auction was designed to recoup that cost, and then some, lining the pockets of the territorial officials in the process. But no one had ever challenged it before. The county clerk, a nervous man with ink-stained fingers, hurried forward with his ledger. After a tense consultation with the auctioneer and several other officials, they confirmed that the man's assertion was correct. If he paid the actual debt, the county had no legal grounds to continue the auction. The law, such as it was, required only that the county's expenses be covered. Callahan stepped forward, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip. "That's not how this works," he growled. But the rancher was faster. His own pistol cleared leather in a smooth motion that spoke of years of practice, and suddenly the entire square went quiet. "I'm paying the legal debt," the rancher said calmly. "Anyone got a problem with that? Take it up with the territorial court. But these women are coming with me, and they're coming as free employees, not indentured servants. They'll work for fair wages, and they can leave whenever they choose." For a long moment, no one moved. Then the county clerk, perhaps seeing a way out of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his control, snatched the dollar from the rancher's hand and made a show of recording the transaction in his ledger. "Sold," he said quickly, his voice cracking slightly. As the rancher holstered his gun and gestured for Sarah and Mei Lin to follow him, both women found their voices at the same time. Sarah's face flushed with humiliation and anger. "You'll regret this day," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "We're not charity cases. We're not broken things you can fix to make yourself feel righteous." Mei Lin's dark eyes flashed with similar fire. "You think $1 makes you better than them?" she added, gesturing at the dispersing crowd. "You think we should be grateful to be bought for the price of a loaf of bread? You'll regret this day, I promise you that." The rancher looked at them both for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Maybe so," he said. "But at least you'll be around to tell me so. Now come on. Storm's getting worse, and my ranch is 2 hours' ride from here." The journey to the ranch was brutal. The snow fell harder, and the temperature dropped as the weak winter sun disappeared behind thick clouds. The rancher, who finally introduced himself as John Mackenzie, had brought a wagon with supplies and 2 horses. He offered the wagon to Sarah and Mei Lin, taking one of the horses for himself, and led them out of town without another word. Huddled together in the back of the wagon, wrapped in blankets that Mackenzie had provided, the 2 women talked in low voices. They had been strangers before this day, but shared trauma had forged an instant bond between them. They made plans, whispered promises to each other. They would work for Mackenzie just long enough to save some money, and then they would leave. They would find their own way, build their own lives, and never again allow themselves to be dependent on anyone, especially not some self-righteous rancher who thought $1 made him their savior. When they finally arrived at the Mackenzie ranch, exhausted and half-frozen, they found it smaller than expected but well-maintained. The main house was modest but solid, with smoke rising from the chimney. A barn stood nearby, and several outbuildings dotted the property. It was clear that Mackenzie ran the operation largely by himself, perhaps with occasional help from hired hands. He showed them to a small cabin on the property, separate from the main house. It had 2 beds, a stove, and basic furnishings. "This is yours," he said simply. "I'll pay you each $20 a month plus room and board. Work includes cooking, cleaning, mending, and helping with the animals when needed. Sundays are euron. You want to leave? Tell me and I'll take you to town or give you horses if you prefer. No obligation beyond honest work for honest pay." Sarah and Mei Lin exchanged glances. It was more than they'd expected, but their pride still stung. "We don't need your pity," Sarah said coldly. Mackenzie's expression didn't change. "Good," he said. "Because I'm not offering any. I need help running this place, and you need work. That's business, not charity. Now get some rest. We start tomorrow at dawn." Over the following weeks, something unexpected happened. The work was hard but fair. Mackenzie was a man of few words, but his actions spoke clearly. He treated both women with respect, never once suggesting that they owed him anything beyond the work they'd agreed to do. He ate the same food they prepared for him without complaint, whether it was good or bad. When Sarah fell ill with a fever, he rode through a snowstorm to fetch the doctor and paid the bill without comment. When Mei Lin accidentally broke a valuable tool, he simply shrugged and said accidents happen. More surprisingly, He seemed genuinely interested in their thoughts and opinions. When Sarah suggested a better way to organize the supply shed, he listened and implemented her idea. When Mei Lin shared techniques her father had taught her for caring for horses, Mackenzie thanked her and asked her to teach him. He never lorded his ownership of the ranch over them, never reminded them of how they'd come to be there. Slowly, almost against their will, both women found their anger softening. They began to see Mackenzie not as the arrogant savior they'd imagined, but as a lonely man who'd seen an injustice and acted on instinct, without thinking about whether he'd be thanked for it. They learned that he'd lost his own family years ago, his wife and young daughter to cholera, and that he'd been running the ranch alone ever since, unable to bear the thought of replacing them but equally unable to give up the life they'd built together. One evening, nearly 3 months after that cold auction day, the three of them sat around the fire in the main house. It had become a comfortable routine, this quiet time after the day's work was done. Sarah was mending one of Mackenzie's shirts, Mei Lin was reading aloud from a book they'd been sharing, and Mackenzie was working on repairing a saddle. "You were right," Sarah said suddenly, breaking the rhythm of Mei Lin's reading. Both of them looked at her. "We told you that you'd regret that day. But I think we were wrong." Mackenzie looked up from his work, his weathered face creasing into what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Maybe you were, maybe you weren't," he said. "Regret's a funny thing. Sometimes what seems like a mistake turns out to be the best decision you ever made. And sometimes it's both at once." Mei Lin set down her book. "We regret how we spoke to you that day," she said quietly. "You didn't deserve that." "Sure I did," Mackenzie replied, returning to his saddle work. "You were scared and angry and proud, and some stranger bought you for $1 like you weren't worth more than that. I'd have said worse in your position." "But that's not what you did," Sarah insisted. "That's not what you were doing at all." Mackenzie shrugged. "Doesn't matter what I meant. What matters is what you felt. Your anger was earned, even if it wasn't owed to me specifically. World had given you every reason to distrust any man who claimed to be helping." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling and the wind howling outside. Finally, Mei Lin spoke again. "We'd like to stay," she said. "Not because we have to, but because we want to. If you'll have us. As partners, maybe, not just hired hands. We've saved most of our wages. We could invest in the ranch, help build it into something bigger." Sarah nodded in agreement. "We've got ideas. Things we could do to make this place more profitable. We're not asking for charity or handouts. We're asking for a chance to build something together. Equal partners." Mackenzie set down the saddle and looked at both of them, his eyes reflecting the firelight. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he stood and walked to a shelf, taking down a bottle of whiskey and 3 glasses he'd never used before. He poured carefully, handed each woman a glass, and raised his own. "To regrets," he said quietly. "And to second chances. And to building something better than what we left behind." They clinked glasses, and as Sarah tasted the harsh whiskey, she realized that their words on that cold auction day had been both right and wrong. Mackenzie might have regretted that day in ways he'd never voice, might have lain awake some nights wondering if he'd done the right thing or just complicated his solitary life beyond repair. But if he had such regrets, they were the kind worth having, the kind that came from choosing to act rather than stand aside, from extending trust even when it might not be returned. As for Sarah and Mei Lin, they had their own regrets about that day, but not the ones they'd promised. They regretted their quickness to judge, their assumption that every kindness came with strings attached, their inability to see past their own pain to recognize someone else's. But they were learning, slowly, that regret wasn't always a burden. Sometimes it was a teacher, showing you how much you'd grown, how far you'd come from the frightened women on that auction block to the confident partners planning a future they'd build with their own hands. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the land in white. But inside, 3 people sat by the fire, no longer strangers bound by transaction but family forged by choice, and if they had regrets about that cold winter day, they were the kind of regrets that made life richer rather than poorer, that proved that sometimes the smallest investments, even a single dollar, could yield returns beyond measure.